So, guys, I want to review the special episode of Family Matters called The Gun. And the reason why it's called a special episode is that it started really in the 1980s with shows like, um, it, what's that show with Gary Coleman? Um, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but like special episodes are really like episodes where they focus more on a very serious subject matter. Like in like that show with Gary Coleman, there was an episode with the bicycle man, and that was supposed to teach advocate to people how to deal with child molestation and encourage messages like, okay, well, if you know what's going on, you should tell your parents. If your parents know what's going on, that you call the police and not do something like try to approach the person or whatever. Because there's been situations where people try to approach people who they allege did stuff to their kids or other people's kids, and that those people like delete all their evidence or whatever. So there's always like and also in the 80s there were also like special episodes of television shows to also talk about issues, especially with drugs and other things like say no to drugs or whatever. And in the 90s, in the 2000s, I don't really remember a lot of famous ones, but in the 90s there's also ones about like gun violence and domestic violence and other issues like that, really. And then this kind of brings me to the episode The Gun and Family Matters, where it is about gun violence. And I do think that this is a very powerful episode for a lot of reasons. And what happens is that there's this girl like Tony that Laura runs into at school, and she like harasses Laura, and then she's like, you better give me your jacket and whatever. And then what happens is that she beats up Laura, and Laura goes home, and then Laura's family puts charges on Tony. So there are a couple of things about it. Like I do think it's a little interesting just how, and I know that this is kind of a little controversial that with Carl being there, Carl being a cop. Really, he's very easy to put charges on people who mess with his family, and there are people who do that. And then there's also that thing too when Eddie and other people, Eddie or Urkel and other people get in trouble. He's willing to kind of talk to police officers and get his kids out of trouble. He makes them, he disciplines them very harshly. So sometimes people may say that that's good parenting or bad parenting, but that kind of almost teaches, well, don't worry, I can always use the law to make consequences or get you out of more severe consequences. So it kind of makes you kind of wonder if Carl is actually a really good parent or whatever, or if he's actually kind of a corrupt police officer because sometimes, what good parents would do is that they're cops, they would let their kids deal with the law instead of like try to get them out of trouble. But obviously people do care about their kids, so sometimes it's that balance of caring about your kid, but also understanding that Carl does bail his kids out, like Eddie, out of trouble a lot, really. So it's kind of questionable. And then also too that somebody beats up somebody's kid, sometimes people let the school handle it. They would not try to put charges on people because like putting charges will ruin somebody's life, really. So what happens is they put charges on Tony. She's out on bail, and then back at school, like Tony flashes a gun at Laura, and then Laura thinks about like getting a gun to protect herself. And the thing that I like about it, and I know that this is kind of racial, but I do like that they have the gun seller being a white kid because usually with a lot of shows like this, they may have an attitude of showing only black kids with guns, like saying that that's really an African American issue because there's always stereotypes, especially in the early '90s of okay, like you look at like you look at a lot of hip hop. You look at a lot of hip hop music videos that sometimes you see a bunch of black musicians holding guns or talking about gun life, or you talk about the gang culture and the thug life and everything like that. So sometimes what they could have done in Family Matters is just have all the people like the gun sellers and people holding guns all be black people, and I'm happy that they didn't do that because that creates a stereotype that that's just African Americans. And then you look at something like Columbine where that was white kids, or a lot of the shootings that happen in America at school or mass shootings that's usually done by like white Americans that when you show just it's not just a one race issue that's important because it breaks those stereotypes, and I know that that's important to me. Like obviously, um, I think writing the show that a lot of shows would overlook that. I do think that like the person selling guns to Laura, um, I do think it was very influenced by Taxi Driver because it does remind me of the scene where where the guy was selling guns to I think Easy Andy is his name. Easy Andy selling guns to Robert De Niro's character Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver. And I also kind of like what the guy was saying. You know, this is helping me get through law school, and I kind of like that because it's like the irony of that. You know, he's doing something illegal to help him go through school for, and there's irony because usually if you, I think you want something to be, if you want to go to law school and have something very prestigious in your life, you know, why would you be doing something stupid like selling guns? So it does kind of talk about like how a little stupid, how hypocritical it is, but also I think that there's a message in how it's like latchkey kids and how like some people will just like sell drugs or whatever or do other like bad things in order to make extra money really. So there is a sense in and as I said, like somebody who just makes money doing the wrong thing. And then what happens is that like a shooting happens. Like one of Laura's friends buys a gun, and I think they're shooting it with Tony and whatever, shooting it out with Tony, and then like it goes all crazy. And what I like about that is usually in Family Matters, I think it's shot in front of a television audience, so you see a lot of crane shots, you see a lot of like zooms, and you'll see a lot of still shots. But in this episode, you kind of see a lot of handheld shots. It looks like they had steady cams. Like if you ever watch The Shining, they use like steady cams, and sometimes or in football they use steady cams. So it's like like you hold the camera, but you have like a stabilizer, so therefore it can be a little shaky, but it controls it from being super shaky. I think a great example of it is in Saving Private Ryan, where they use Steadicams and regular cam and Steadicams and handheld cameras to create some of the early scenes. But I like that because obviously if you change up the camera style and the edit, it kind of makes the action stand out more because they don't really use that in Family Matters. So I like that because it kind of makes it more edgy. But I also kind of like that that they kind of went a little like dark in this episode. And I think like that's one thing I like about this episode is that I kind of felt there was a lot of attention on making this episode really around the theme of gun violence, where you kind of almost look at the episode where Carl, the good cop bad cop episode, where what hurts it is Urkel and Richie going to the dentist and Urkel like messing up things at the dentist with laughing gas. That sometimes when you have an episode like this where it's more focused on gun violence, and they're more serious about it, and they make like all the scenes about Laura, and her situation, you actually have a stronger episode because you're not kind of jumping around with different stuff, or there's something very comedic going on. Sometimes that can, as I said, it creates a juxtaposition that sometimes, as I said, it's a juxtaposition of calm before the storm, where you may want to have a couple funny things or a period piece before you go into something really dark, because then when that happens, the dark thing really stands out a lot more. So sometimes that's helpful, but sometimes it becomes a little bit like Rurouni Kenshin. Like in that anime, there's always been issues of characters saying something serious, then the other characters kind of go into humor, and then something serious is said, then it goes into humor again, then something serious is said, and then goes into humor again. Like it kind of breaks up the seriousness of the scene or the seriousness of the episode or the seriousness of the situation. And I don't think they do that in this episode. I also think that one thing I don't like about this episode is that I do think that they should have had a conversation between Laura and her mom, or Laura and Carl, and then her getting grounded for trying to consider buying a gun, really. Because I really think that that's kind of like also the message. Not really like, oh, well, she wanted to buy a gun, and that kind of gets thrown away because there's actual shooting. I really think that there should have been like a powerful scene of her parents talking to her, but also making consequences for like saying like, I know you were scared, but that was the wrong thing to do, and what could have happened. And some of the things they could have talked about was like, you're a very smart girl, you're like cheerleader, you have really good grades, you're going to college, there's scholarships, and you want wasted over trying to shoot a hood rat or whatever. I know that you were scared, but there was a lot of things that are going on, and I think that they could have communicated that. I also think that one thing I don't like about this episode is they said that, when Laura, no, when Carl and his wife were both kids, they were worrying about like the prom and other things like that. But nowadays, kids have to worry about being shot at. Um, I do think that I didn't like that because I believe that school shootings and people bringing guns and killing people at school, that was, in my philosophy, that's always been an issue since the dawn of time. Really, it's probably got more attention in the '90s because more people are talking about those things. But I do think that it's important to kind of say that because I think that some people always think that, well, that happened in the '90s. I think they just got more attention. But I also think there are other issues in school. Like obviously, sexual harassment was a big deal in schools in the, in the '80s, '70s, '60s, '50s, and other things like that. Or you look at bullying, you look at other issues. So I do think that one thing I don't like about this episode is they kind of almost act like, okay, well, it's the early '90s, therefore, schools are now like a place that are dangerous. When actually, there's always been issues in schools. So I didn't like that. And then also too that they start a campaign at the end of the end of the episode where people turn in guns. And there's two things that I like about it. I like how there's only one person that turns in a gun and people are not interested. And I like that because it's trying to make a point that people always do things like this, but it's but in reality, not a lot of people are gonna like turn in their guns or do whatever really, or try to make a difference. It's just a small group of people, but still, it's significant that small group of people want to make a difference, because that adds to a level of realism. It's not like, okay, well, everyone's gonna turn their guns and everyone's gonna be singing "Kumbaya" because that's not true to reality. But I also kind of like, and I know it may be a little racial, but I wish it was kind of like two black people doing it, not like two white people, because I think that again, because I just think that would have been kind of like stronger, really, because I think then you kind of almost have that stereotype of like two white people being the morality piece. I think that they did like those two white people at the end and then two black people. I think that would have been better, not just two white guys turning in guns at the end, because I do think that it does come off as like, okay, well, the white guys can kind of be moral, but the black guys are not that moral. So I wish, when it comes to like gun safety or changing their attitude about guns, I think that would have been stronger if they had like both races, since they also represent both races being involved with guns earlier in the episode. I think that would have been stronger. I also did not like Urkel like just talking about like turning in guns. Like he gets on top of like a table and he starts rapping and dancing. And I also think that one thing I don't like is that everybody's kind of looking up and like, because it kind of adds to what the issue with Family Matters is that sometimes, as I said, Urkel hams it up really. And I also think that I know he's trying to be cool. He's like a celebrity at this point, and people are turning in to watch Urkel as well. But sometimes there is a level where I think Jaleel White kind of comes off he like really Urkel maybe had the mentality of like Urkel almost has the mentality of a 10-year-old attention whore. Like he kind of reminds me when I was a kid, and trying to get attention. So I do think that maybe there's something you see with Urkel, like maybe unintentionally, he doesn't understand that that maybe some of his approaches almost puts the ball on him a little bit too much, or he comes off as very silly and antisocial. And I do think that that's part of his personality. But I also think that with good writing, I also think there's a level of hamming it up or kind of just being a little too celebratory with characters. I do think that sometimes you got to cut down on that because it just feels a little too campy or too silly. So that's how I feel about it. But I do think it's a very powerful episode. They did make an attempt. They did understand. And a lot of shows have this mentality of, okay, well, they're very popular. They're over with people. So they have to make big differences because they have to take a form of social responsibility. So I do think there's a lot of strengths in this episode. I also felt that was a little out of character for Laura to get a gun. But I do think that because there's enough bad things that happen to her in the episode. And teenagers, and I think like with the Winslow family, that's kind of like their curse is that they kind of like struggle with temptation a little bit. So I do think that the episode is realistic for Laura to kind of make a character change, but they did a very good job with this episode. But I do think that the only issue I kind of felt that was like really Urkel hamming it up at the end, And I also think the other issue was that Laura and her parents did not have a conversation with her, but also did not like ground her for trying to buy a gun. 'Cause I think that would have been. I think there would have been some talking points and a very emotional scene with that about just really about that. But I also think that having that would have been more powerful than a generalization of, oh well, now, when we were in high school we had to worry about zits and the prom. Now kids worry about guns and whatever. Really, like I know like times have changed, but I do think the stronger message would have been telling Laura you don't buy guns to solve a problem, and you bring things up to her parents, and that be that really. And her parents know a lot about how um, to deal with something like that. So it's not like, okay, well, you snitched, you're gonna get shot. It's we're gonna make you safe and whatever. So that be that really. So there's some errors, but it's kind of very minor. But this is a very good episode.